Welcome back to Daisy Asks. I'm Amy G. I'm a clinical psychologist and true crime enthusiast who's been looking into the Delphi case, deep diving documents, evidence, and research to figure out what's going on in the case. And in this series, I'm analysing the crime scene using behavioural science. This is educational only. It's not legal advice, it's not expert opinion, and it's not about guilt or innocence. It's about what the offender's behaviour at the scene reveals about the type of person who committed these murders. So let's dive in and see what the crime scene actually reveals. Crime scene behaviour is one of the strongest predictors of offender type. It's empirical, patterned, and highly consistent across cases. Behaviour at the scene is essentially the offender's psychological fingerprint. And this Delphi crime scene has a lot of detail in it that helps give us clues about who might be responsible for this horrific murder. The clues that it gives suggest that it's not some of the typical names that show up in relation to this case. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I'm of the opinion that Richard Allen is not the offender of the Delphi murders. I don't believe that the crime scene indicates a first-time offender with no history of deviance or sadism. I don't also believe that it represents the work of a CSAM offender, because in most cases, CSAM offenders don't actually meet their victims. And I don't believe that this is a rage attack, something done by someone who is a family member or someone who is doing this for monetary gain. The scene is too organized, it's too intentional, and it's too ritualized. So let's look at some of the aspects of the crime scene that indicate that this crime is highly likely to have been committed by a sadistic, organized offender. Now, I haven't done an exhaustive description of the crime scene in this video, but I'm happy to do that in one of the upcoming episodes of this series. But for today, I'm going to pick out the main aspects of the crime scene that are indicative of an organized sadistic offender. I won't be showing any crime scene depictions out of respect for Abby and Libby. However, sketches of the crime scene are widely available online. So if you're interested in seeing the specific arrangement of the sticks and how the bodies were positioned, if you do a simple Google search, you should be able to find those. Beware, unfortunately, some of the official crime scene pictures have been leaked, so I caution you to be very careful what you click on, because the crime scene is horrific and most of us don't want to see the bodies of these two beautiful girls whose lives were taken so horrifically. So a couple of notable things about the crime scene. The scene was about a 30-foot zone. There was deliberate placement of the bodies. Both girls were on their backs, in the same orientation, within the same 30-foot forensic radius. And there just wasn't any evidence of chaotic collapse paths. And what this looks like is intentional positioning, an offender asserting dominance over what the girls look like. And organised offenders position bodies to control the post-mortem image. Secondly, we see clothing manipulation and exchange. Abby's wearing some of Libby's clothing. Libby is unclothed. This is not anger, panic, or impulsivity. This is symbolic. Offenders who do this are in that very rare subset of sexual homicide offenders with ritualized control behaviors. Clothing removal or exchange is a top marker of paraphilic humiliation. Now, I know the branch placement is a divisive issue, and even if we throw Odinism out of the picture completely, we still see indications of symbolic staging rather than concealment. True concealment would involve a more fuller coverage of the bodies, but symbolic staging uses selective, deliberate object placement. There's large limbs over Libby's body. There's linear placement noted by the officers who came upon the scene, and only about 3% coverage from all the sticks. This just doesn't seem like concealment. Instead, it's symbolic behavior, which is associated with fantasy-driven sadists, not CSAM offenders or rage killers. The staging zone is fairly clean. It's not indicative of chaos. There's disturbed soil, mainly under the bodies. There is a large blood pool neatly bounded with the asterisk pattern of sticks on top of it. There aren't any indications of running, flailing, defensive flight, or chaos. We know also that the girls did not show signs of defensive wounds. And so what this looks like is a controlled, confident, fantasy-driven behaviour. There don't seem to be indications of panic or uncontrolled emotionality in the offender. Organised offenders maintain a stable operational zone. Over-controlled rituals create clean pockets despite violence. The crime scene just looks too neat and not chaotic as we would expect in more of a situational offence related to emotional instability, rage, anger, trying to silence someone who maybe someone was offending against. Instead, this looks like a planned, organised mission to kill. Whilst there is some drag evidence, it's more suggestive of repositioning rather than relocation. There is a blood trail along the drag path, and Abby's blood is beneath her. It's likely that she died there. There aren't any abrasions from transport, and lividity is fixed on the backs. Offenders who kill off-site and dump bodies do not stage. Offenders who stage do so on site for arousal or fantasy. So it seems the violence occurred where they were found, and repositioning was to arrange, not to hide. It's extremely unlikely they were taken elsewhere. The blood dynamics, lividity patterns, and drag traces all point to on-site domination and on-site homicide. And I'll explain this further in future episodes. Now, people have commented on the time frame, and the speed at which this crime likely occurred is actually still consistent with a sadistic murderer. I was quite surprised to find that a lot of the sadistic serial killers that many of us hear about, Ted Bundy, BTK, were able to commit their crimes in a fairly short time frame. Particularly when a homicide is outdoors, we would expect the speed at which the crime occurs to be shorter because the offender is trying to evade capture. He doesn't want to be found. And so there would have been maybe more of a rush to complete this crime and get out. But even in cases where they're not dealing with outdoor public zones, sadistic killers are able to be fast and controlled in their acts. Offenders who've had internal rehearsal can perform with startling speed. They're not improvising. They're enacting a pre-existing fantasy script. And again, the speed of the offence is consistent with a pre-planned crime rather than a depressed man who lashed out in anger or a CSAM offender who decided to engage in a contact offence. It's highly unlikely that this is a rage killer, and it's highly unlikely that this was a first act of violence. So, what does this scene mean? Well, as I said before, this is a sexually sadistic organised homicide. There are behavioural clusters that indicate this. We see control behaviour, we see symbolic humiliation, clothing manipulation, post-mortem organisation, object placement with meaning, fixed ritual zone, and calm execution. And research consistently shows that CSAM offenders don't commit sadistic homicides. Rage killers never stage or ritualize. Depressed men don't suddenly develop sexual sadism at middle age. And first-time offenders rarely create such a ritualized scene. So who is the offender unlikely to be? And this is based on real-world research and case histories. This is unlikely to be a CSAM offender. For example, Kegan Kline. And I think we can all agree that Kegan Kline's offences are horrific, and he has been convicted for prolific CSAM offences. However, what the research shows is the crossover to hands-on sadism in this type of offender is extremely low. CSAM consumers are generally avoidant, solitary, driven by compulsive online use, and actually have extremely low violence rates. They rarely stage bodies outdoors. They rarely leave home or meet their victims, let alone dominate two victims. In fact, many of the catfishing sex offenders who do actually meet their victims only ever meet with one victim. I couldn't find a case where an offender who had catfished a young victim online had met with more than one individual. Now, people might say perhaps Kegan was only anticipating meeting one of the girls. However, if he had then arrived at the scene and seen both, it's unlikely that an offender like Kegan Kline would then abduct two girls and control them, murder them, and stage their bodies in the way that we see in the Delphi murders. Kegan specifically doesn't show indicators of sadism. He doesn't actually have a history of physical violence and doesn't show signs of organizational capability. In fact, his profile is consistent with avoidance and isolation. He just doesn't align with an outdoor dominance-based homicide. And even the speculation that he could be involved in a larger ring or be involved with other characters who could be responsible for this seems unlikely, because Kegan Kline would be a weak link in a network of people capable of perpetrating a crime like this. Now, who else is not likely to be the offender? Well, a depressed, anxious, middle-aged man with no history of violence or deviance, no indicators of sadism. Depression is certainly not associated with sadism. In fact, it's associated with social withdrawal, passivity, hopelessness, low energy, impaired decision-making, a lot of the stuff that we see in Rick Allen. It's not associated with symbolic violence, ritualized staging, sexual sadism, body posing, and control of two victims. Rick, as we've talked about before in the Forensic Unicorn series, is the behavioral opposite of this offender type. Now, I know that law enforcement made this suggestion perhaps that Rick had snapped, that he was alcohol-fueled and he lost his cool and attacked these girls. And again, this is highly unlikely because this crime scene is not consistent with a rage killer. Rage homicides are impulsive, chaotic, loud, uncontrolled. There's no staging, object symbolism, clothing exchange, postmortem rituals. Delphi is the opposite of the rage pattern. Whoever killed these girls had planned it out. It was organized. It was an enactment of a fantasy. It was not a sudden snap because the person needed to silence the victims or lashed out at victims that weren't complying. Now, I don't think it's likely that the girls were moved elsewhere and returned. And again, this is a divisive issue, but offenders who abduct, kill, return, and restage don't really exist. And certainly not in the case of the crime scene that we're discussing, because at that stage in the evening, there were already search parties out looking for the girls. And realistically, whilst the search was called off by law enforcement, unofficially there were people searching throughout the night. And so it's highly unlikely that someone returned with the bodies and staged them. In addition, the blood pattern evidence, the lividity, the lack of abrasions, all indicate that the bodies remained in place post-mortem. So what type of offender does fit? A sadistic offender. If you'd like to learn more about sadism, please watch our recent Forensic Unicorn episode where we discuss the profile of sadism and the anti-sadist profile, which aligns very well with Richard Allen's profile. So a sexually sadistic, organized, fantasy-driven offender likely has a number of behavioral traits. We would expect them to be calm under pressure, to have planned internal fantasies, an enjoyment of control, the ability to stage, ritualistic thinking, an interest in humiliation, symbolic meaning attached to objects, a willingness to take risks. And this sort of offender doesn't just occur out of the blue at middle age. What you'll find if you look into any sadistic offender, be that Ted Bundy, BTK, and even Russell Williams, is an indication of escalation patterns, narcissistic traits, an enjoyment of control, status, domination. And in many of these offenders, we see early paraphilias, we see prior hands-on attacks, we see sexual arousal to dominance, voyeurism, fetishism, and indicators of cruelty. As we've mentioned, Russell Williams is a rare offender that shows less of those indicators. However, when we unpacked Russell Williams' life history, we can see indicators of a need for control, indicators of fractured relationships with his family, indicators of a fairly low emotional range, a low level of expressiveness, and a drive for power and prestige. These offenders that that are the wolves in sheep's clothing are incredibly rare. And most of the time, they've started offending far earlier than when they're caught. And so, whilst they may appear normal externally, there are indicators of deviance and often criminal histories dating right back to their 20s and histories of violence predating even that. So, the idea that there are normal appearing people walking around who are monsters is probably a bit overplayed in the media. They're a very rare group of offenders, and the majority of them do show signs of deviancy behind the scenes. So, in conclusion, the crime scene, the condition of the bodies are not consistent with Richard Allen being the offender. They're not even consistent with Kegan Kline being the offender. What they indicate is a sadistic offender. Could it be one? Could it be multiple? The chances are that it's one main perpetrator who has the sadistic profile and perhaps others that have supported or helped that key offender. Now, this offender had planned what they were doing and they executed it with confidence. They staged it with symbolic meaning. It was done on site and it was done quickly. This is likely somebody who had shown indicators of violence, who had shown indicators of an unusual interest in ritualistic behaviors and thinking, somebody who liked control and dominance, somebody who enjoyed humiliating others. Somebody who didn't show a high level of emotional range and internalization. If you spend even a few minutes looking into Richard Allen, you'll note that he's none of those things. I'm going to continue this series alongside the longer lives about the forensic unicorn, looking at forensic psychology and historical cases to demonstrate why I don't believe Richard Allen is the perpetrator of this crime, and hopefully helping to get a clearer picture of the type of person who may be responsible for the horrific murders of Abby and Libby. So watch this space for more videos. Please like and comment below. Your feedback and your ideas are absolutely welcome. And please subscribe if you haven't already, because there's loads more Delphi content to come. So take care and I'll speak to you soon.